Francis P. opened his eyes and found himself in a garden. This was the first moment of his life, or at the very least, the first moment that he would be able to remember. And as he looked around, he could see the blue skies and the sun shining in it. He could see the flowers blooming, and a ways off he could hear his brothers playing around a fountain. And at that moment he realized he was in love with his existence. In his boyhood he would go off into the wilderness, and he would run around in the streams, pulling up stones to see if crawdads or lizards were beneath him. He would climb up trees, and he would feel the wind on his face and listen to the birds sing. He had an appetite for life. He was enraptured by the colors and the sounds. But, as it must be, there cannot be sunny days without stormy ones. There cannot be good without evil. There cannot be light without darkness. And one day he was pulling up some logs when he found a snake coiled beneath one of them. And the snake struck him the moment that he lifted up the log, and he fell down onto the ground, and it was fortunate for him that his brother Sam happened to be nearby. And his brother ran over as the snake was slithering away, and he picked him up, and he took him home. And the family was in a state. They called for the doctor, and the doctor looked him over and found it to be one of the most curious cases he had ever came across. For Francis P. was alive. He was breathing, but he didn't have a pulse or a heartbeat. And he was pure white, and his eyes were misty, and his hair was sticking up on his head. And he was almost, as the doctor would later describe, lost. That was the best thing he could say. But the whole town thought the little boy was going to die. A preacher was even called down, and a sermon delivered, and a coffin was picked out for him. But then one morning, months after the snake bite, the mother was laying in bed when she opened her eyes and she saw her son standing there. And he was like a corpse, and he was staring at her without even blinking. And he asked her, "Where am I?" And she said, "You're home. My son, you're home." And he just continued to stare at her. But after a few days, they were able to get him to sit down at the kitchen and get some food and water in him, and the color began to return to his face. And they found that he didn't remember anything that happened after the snake bite. The only thing he could say was that there was darkness, and he heard people talking. But he didn't have too many repercussions from this illness that happened to him. The only thing was that he had a few nightmares later on in life. But if you think that this caused his appetite for life to diminish, or that he became more cautious towards it, I am afraid to tell you that that was not the case. In fact, it made him an even more mischievous child, and when he entered the school system, he was always causing trouble. He would bring in snakes and spiders and turtles into the school, and one time he even let loose a hog, and it took a long time for them to be able to wrangle it up and put it in a cage. But he had another side to him, a side that he kept away from his schoolmates who all thought that he was the perfect Tom Sawyer for them. He loved comic books. He loved stories about pirates and story about wild frontiersmen, and he would read them, but he never told anyone else about this. He kept this secret. Now, as he entered into his high school years, he became handsome, and all the girls tried to woo him, but he was in love with only one, an Abigail Wilson. Now, Abigail was not a pretty girl. She was a troll of a woman. And when he started dating her, she was actually with two other boys. But they ended up working that out, and the two of them got married. Now, this should be the end of the story. We could end with a rather picturesque scene of Francis P. and Abigail Wilson going off into the sunlight, into some maybe green valley. But this is real life. And as it happened, tragedy struck the country, for this was World War II, and on the big screen and in the papers, people were talking about how the men needed to go off to war, to fight for their country. And the women were told that they needed to make equipment, that they needed to provide for their boys. And all of his schoolmates, all of Francis P.'s schoolmates were signing up to fight. And he wasn't going to be any different. Maybe it was for his old childhood love of adventure stories, or maybe it was that he was just trying to protect his country. But he signed up, and he was taken to a Sergeant Porterhouse. Now, Francis P. was with a few of his other schoolmates, a big fat boy, I don't actually have his name, and another boy that was way too thin. But when Sergeant Porterhouse came out, Francis P. found his match. For all his life, he had been mischievous, and now he was finding that he was having to be very studious. He was having to be very particular about his appearance. And he did try. He had come to the point in his life where he had lost much of the rapscallion of his youth. But it was hard for him, and he found himself always having to do laps. And Sergeant Porterhouse hated Francis P. as far as he could tell, more so than any of the other soldiers. But then he did remember one moment that happened that made him question everything. One day he was cleaning up when the sergeant came up, and he straightened himself up and realized that his shoes were untied, and he was afraid Sergeant Porterhouse was going to yell at him. And he was sure that the sergeant saw that his shoes were untied, but for whatever reason he didn't say anything. He just told him to go back to the kitchen now and that he could have something to eat. But after basic training, Francis P. and his schoolmates were shipped off to war. Now, you've all read stories about war. You know that it's not all picture storybooks. But there's a part of war that's not often talked about, and that is the boredom of it. People sit around for hours waiting for something to happen, anything. And sometimes, for some soldiers, nothing does happen. And that's what Francis P. found himself doing, playing cards most of the day and smoking, and finding himself, well, to be honest, very much wishing that the whole thing was over, just so he didn't have to be so bored. But the thing also about war is that when something does happen, it happens. Francis P. would find himself fighting in Iwo Jima, and he saw many of his own schoolmates fall. The fat boy was riddled with bullets, blood dripping down his face. His friend, the thin one, didn't die, but lost his legs, and soon enough all of his fellow soldiers were dying all around him, but Francis P. was managing to survive. He escaped all the bullet shots, even though they seemed so close to him. But then one day, as he was walking about, he could hear the gunshots firing, and he knew that he was running out of time and that he was surrounded. And as he stood there, he looked up, and he saw a man, dressed in a black robe, with bright red shining eyes, and the longest fingers that he had ever saw. And no sooner did he see this man running towards him, that he let out a cry, and he fell down onto the ground. And, then everything was black. He remembered waking up for a moment, and he saw some doctors speaking around him, and the doctors were saying that he was going to be all right, but they didn't know how he had managed to survive. And then Sergeant Porterhouse came in. As it so happened, he was in that area. And he was walking down the halls, and he heard that his old soldier was there, Francis P. And he felt inclined to visit him. So he walked up and he sat down, and as our friend opened his eyes, he looked up at Sergeant Porterhouse, who sat there with a smile on his face, looking a lot less stern than he had as a sergeant, and he said, "You're okay, my boy. Everything's going to be all right. You're going to be discharged from the army. You're going back home." And Francis P. said, "But I don't want to go home. I want to stay here. I can't leave." And Sergeant Porterhouse said, "Oh, you're saying that now, but you have a wife waiting for you, and you have your own life to live. You've served your country, and you've served it well. They can't expect any more from you than you have already done." And Francis P. looked up. "You don't understand. I can't leave because there's no escaping it anymore. This place was meant for me, and I was meant for it. I was sent here. You see, when I was a young boy, I was bitten by a snake, and they thought that I was going to die, but I didn't. And my whole life, I have thought that that was going to be the end of it, but now I realize that death missed me that time, that I was supposed to die from that snake bite, as I was supposed to die when those soldiers were shooting. All through my life, I've been supposed to die, and now death is finally claiming me. I've let everyone down, and I feel it is my time to die now. And Sergeant Porthouse got up and said, "Don't you say that. Nobody is meant to die. You're not destined, and you didn't let anyone down." "I see it," said Francis P. "Death. I see him wandering these bedside tables, coming for souls, and sometimes he'll look over at me, and it seems like he's trying to reach me, but he can't. But he's going to find me eventually. Even if I leave this war, he will find me." Sergeant Porterhouse said, "No, you're talking nonsense. It'll be all right, my son." And Francis P. said, "Why? Why do we all fight? What is the point of war? What are we doing it for?" Now, this is the point of the story where Sergeant Porterhouse could say what he always said, that there was a reason for war, that they were defending themselves. But that is not what he said. I don't believe it would have been an honest answer for him. He said, "I don't know. I don't know, my boy." Francis P. was discharged and even won the Purple Heart. And he was sent home. He didn't tell his wife that he was coming. He wanted it to be a surprise for her, and he made his whole family agree not to say anything. But before he went home, he went to the bar and he took a few drinks. And he looked around and he realized that he would have to go back to normal life, that he had to be a mail carrier, it'd have to be something. And he didn't want to be. He didn't feel that he could ever escape the war. He wanted to be back there. He wanted to be shooting. He wanted to be dying with his friends. But, he knew that he didn't have a choice now. They weren't going to let him back. He had actually lost his hearing in one ear. So, he returned home, and it was quite dark. He walked up, and he felt that something was wrong. Something was off. He noticed that his wife's car wasn't in the parking lot. But he opened the door, and he looked around, and he said hello. And he saw a black shape nearby in the living room. And no sooner than he started walking up than a gunshot went off. The wife, Abigail, would discover what had happened. A burglar had came into the home and had been frightened by Francis P. in there and had shot him. It seemed an odd ending to his story, and a lot of people began to talk about the strangeness of it, that it just so happened there was a burglar there, that the burglar decided to shoot him. It seemed that something else was at work, but no one, except for one person, was able to say what it was. For Sergeant Porterhouse was able to hear about it from the wife, and when he heard the story, he simply hung up the phone, and he looked out. And he didn't know why, but he found himself changed from that moment on. I know all you will think to yourself that it's impossible that a sergeant, trained by the army, could possibly become a gentler soul, that he could lose all of his strictness, and in fact it would be difficult for him to raise new soldiers. But that was the way that it happened. After that, he actually devoted his life to God and became very much more kindly towards people, even though his whole life he had been cruel. And he would often think back to Francis P., and he would wonder to himself, what was it all about? What was war fought for? I would like to say that there was an answer. I'd like to say that it was like in the storybooks, where there was a feeling of victory, that you knew that what you were doing was right. But I am afraid that is not the story I'm telling you all tonight. So, I simply will say that it was. Oh, and by the way, as I feel it must be said, death did indeed claim Francis P.